Each week, Lydia discovers a new bouquet of fresh flowers resting on her husband's grave, and she knows she didn't place them there. The mysterious tributes stir a mix of sorrow and curiosity within her. Determined to uncover the identity of the visitor, Lydia decides to conduct her own stakeout at the cemetery, hiding behind an old oak tree just as dawn breaks. Her heart skips a beat as a familiar figure steps into view. Lydia recognized her out of thousands, and she couldn't help but feel an ache in her chest as the woman was walking towards her husband's grave with a beautiful peony bouquet in hand. She didn't even know she was holding her breath until she noticed her need for air. She took a large intake of breath, but with that sudden sound at the empty graveyard, the woman turned. Lydia was just fast enough to hide behind the tree, keeping herself out of view. "Who's there?" she heard a melodic voice say, but she didn't miss the hint of fear. Lydia decided to remain silent, hoping to hear the continuation of footsteps if she remained hidden. She had to catch her in the act. She had seen the bouquet. If they were on Gerald's grave, she would know enough. It only took a few more moments for the sound of gravel moving under shoes to continue. As soon as it did, Lydia slowly peered her head out from behind the tree again, looking as the woman continued her way. She remembered to breathe this time around as she looked at the woman near Gerald's grave. It was then that the woman did something that Lydia didn't see coming. She walked right past it. Lydia almost took a step from behind the tree as the woman continued her step and stopped maybe 3 graves after the one that belonged to her husband. She saw the woman bow her head, mumble some incoherent words, and place the beautiful bouquet of peonies on his grave. "Shit," Lydia murmured, trying to keep quiet, but couldn't keep the frustration inside. And she noticed it had been a fluke. She really had thought that that woman would have been the one to leave her late husband flowers. They had met only a few times before, but she had definitely been a troublemaker, especially in her marriage. Yet, if it wasn't her, who else could it be? The woman's name was Margaret Collins, and she had worked closely with Lydia's husband, sometimes even calling herself his work wife. This had driven Lydia mad, who had begged Gerald to set boundaries with the woman. Eventually, he did. But Lydia continued to think that they might be involved with one another in a different way than professionally. "How could I have been so wrong?" she murmured as she sat down behind the tree again. She had made a small list of who the person could possibly have left Gerald weekly flowers, and Margaret Collins had been at the top of her list. For Lydia to be wrong, she still couldn't believe it. Then it struck her, a small smirk playing on her lips. That godforsaken woman had probably had a feeling in the pit of her stomach that Lydia had been at the graveyard when she heard that sound. "She probably went to some random grave instead," Lydia said, trying to convince herself. All she now needed to do was wait for Margaret to leave the graveyard and for her to check. She would soon have her answers. As soon as Margaret had left from view, Lydia left the safety of the tree and stalked down the pathway to the grave that was now decorated with fresh peonies. She knew she had her now. It had to be. However, as Lydia stopped by the headstone that Margaret had stopped at, her smile faltered as she read the name carved into the tombstone. Theodore Reginald Collins, the name said, and Lydia immediately knew she had been wrong about her assumptions. He had only died half a year ago, according on the date underneath the name, and Lydia couldn't help but grieve for her. She too had lost someone important to her. Lydia had been so in thought that she almost didn't notice a figure entering the graveyard. Lydia still couldn't believe she was wrong about Margaret. She walked back toward the tree, her thoughts racing. How could she have misjudged Margaret so badly? The peonies weren't for Gerald. She leaned against the tree, the rough bark pressing into her back, grounding her in the moment. Her mind kept replaying the scene, trying to make sense of it all. She sighed deeply, frustration bubbling up inside her. As Lydia mulled over her mistake, she noticed someone else coming down the path. This person moved with a slow, deliberate pace, their face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Lydia squinted, trying to recognize them, but their features remained elusive. Her heart quickened. Who could this be? She stayed rooted to the spot, curiosity and caution battling within her as the figure approached Gerald's grave. Lydia decided to stay hidden. She pressed herself closer to the tree, peeking out just enough to keep an eye on the newcomer. The figure, unaware of her presence, continued down the path. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She needed to see what they were up to, but she couldn't risk being seen. She felt a chill run down her spine as she watched them get closer to Gerald's grave. The person passed by without noticing Lydia. She held her breath, heart pounding as they walked past Gerald's grave and continued down the path. Lydia let out a sigh of relief, but her curiosity was still piqued. Who was this stranger? And what were they doing here? She leaned back against the tree, trying to piece together the puzzle. Her eyes followed the figure until they disappeared from view. Lydia cursed under her breath, frustrated with the uneventful morning. She had hoped to uncover the mystery of the flowers, but now she was back to square one. Her mind raced with questions, each one more pressing than the last. She kicked at the gravel path, a small cloud of dust rising at her feet. "What now?" she muttered, feeling the weight of her unsolved mystery pressing down on her. Lydia kept a close watch on the graveyard, her eyes scanning every inch of the quiet space. She leaned against the tree, trying to stay hidden while observing the surroundings intently. Every rustle of leaves, every bird's chirp seemed louder in the stillness. She felt the tension in her shoulders as she waited for something, anything, to happen. The silence was almost deafening, making her question her resolve. The whole morning remained uneventful. Lydia watched as the hours dragged on, with no one visiting Gerald's grave. She glanced at her watch, frustration growing with each passing minute. Not a single soul had approached the grave, and Lydia was starting to feel the weight of her vigil. She kicked at a pebble, watching it skitter across the path. "What a waste of time," she muttered under her breath. Feeling the urge to use the bathroom, Lydia hesitated to leave her post. She bit her lip, glancing around nervously. She couldn't shake the feeling that the moment she left, something important would happen. But nature was calling, and it was becoming harder to ignore. She shifted from foot to foot, trying to hold out a little longer. Finally, she sighed, realizing she couldn't wait forever. She decided to leave her phone to record the grave while she was gone. Carefully, she propped it up against the tree, making sure it had a clear view of Gerald's headstone. "This better work," she whispered to herself. Lydia set the camera to record, double-checking that it was positioned correctly. She took a deep breath, hoping her plan would pay off, and started to make her way to the bathroom. Lydia hurried to the bathroom, hoping not to miss anything important. She glanced over her shoulder, feeling a pang of anxiety as she walked away from the grave. Quickening her pace, she navigated the winding paths of the graveyard, her mind racing with thoughts of what might happen in her absence. She only hoped that her phone would capture anything she missed. Reaching the restroom, she rushed inside, her heart pounding. Lydia returned from the bathroom and checked the footage on her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the device, eager and anxious to see if anything had happened in her absence. She fast-forwarded through the recording, eyes glued to the screen. At first, it seemed like nothing had changed. The graveyard looked as still and empty as before. Then, she saw it. Movement near Gerald's grave. To her horror, she saw someone stop by Gerald's grave on the recording. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched the figure kneel down beside the headstone. Lydia's mind raced with questions. Who could it be? What were they doing? She paused the video, rewound, and played it again, trying to catch every detail. The figure seemed to move with purpose, but their identity remained hidden. The woman's face was obscured by a black hat, making identification impossible. Lydia squinted at the screen, frustration bubbling up inside her. The hat cast a shadow over the woman's features, hiding her face completely. Lydia cursed under her breath. This mystery visitor had been careful not to reveal too much. Determined to find out more, she pocketed her phone and rushed back toward Gerald's grave. Lydia immediately rushed to Gerald's grave, feeling a sense of urgency. Her feet pounded against the gravel path as she hurried, her heart racing with anticipation. Who was this mysterious visitor? Why were they leaving flowers on Gerald's grave? She needed answers, and she needed them now. Reaching the grave, she came to a sudden stop, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of the person she had seen. She found a beautiful bouquet of white roses on the grave, left by the mysterious visitor. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the flowers. They were fresh and pristine, their petals gleaming in the sunlight. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the soft petals. Whoever had left these flowers had done so with care. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more puzzling than the last. Lydia examined the bouquet closely, noting its pristine condition and fragrant scent. The roses were perfectly arranged, each petal unblemished and fresh. She lifted the bouquet to her nose, inhaling deeply, the sweet fragrance bringing back memories of Gerald. These flowers were carefully chosen and beautifully presented. Her mind raced with questions. Who would take such care in selecting and arranging these roses for her late husband? She wondered who could have left such a thoughtful gift, as white roses were one of Gerald's favorite flowers. Lydia's heart ached with the bittersweet memory of Gerald's fondness for these flowers. The choice couldn't have been a coincidence. Someone knew Gerald well, someone who cared deeply. But who? Lydia turned the bouquet over in her hands, searching for any clues, any hint that might reveal the identity of this mysterious visitor. She decided to approach the cemetery groundskeeper for more information about recent visitors. Lydia spotted him near the entrance, tending to some flower beds. Taking a deep breath, she walked over, clutching the bouquet in her hands. "Excuse me," she called out, catching his attention. The groundskeeper looked up, wiping his hands on his apron. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" Lydia hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Have you noticed anyone unusual visiting recently?" The groundskeeper mentioned seeing a woman in a black hat visiting almost weekly, piquing Lydia's interest. "She comes by mostly in the mornings," he added, scratching his head. Lydia's pulse quickened. This matched the figure she saw in her recording. "Did she ever speak to you?" Lydia asked. The groundskeeper shook his head. "No, she keeps to herself. Always leaves flowers, though." Lydia thanked him, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Lydia's mind raced with possibilities as she tried to connect the clues about the woman's identity. Who was this mysterious woman? How did she know Gerald? The frequent visits, the thoughtful flowers. It all suggested a deep connection. Lydia replayed everything she knew, trying to piece it together. The more she thought about it, the more questions arose. She felt both closer and farther from the truth than ever before. Armed with new information, Lydia resolved to return next week and uncover the truth once and for all. She marked her calendar, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This time, she wouldn't miss a thing. The mystery of the flowers and the unknown visitor consumed her thoughts. She needed answers, and she was determined to get them. As the days passed, Lydia prepared herself mentally for another stakeout at the cemetery.
Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story.
Lydia formulated a plan to stake out the cemetery again the following week, determined to catch the visitor. She made sure her phone was fully charged and brought a small notebook to jot down any observations. This time, she'd arrive even earlier, ensuring she wouldn't miss anyone. Her plan was simple: stay hidden, stay alert, and don't let her guard down. She felt ready for anything. Hiding behind the tree once more, Lydia kept a vigilant watch for any approaching figures. The early morning air was crisp, and the graveyard was quiet. She settled into her hiding spot, her eyes scanning the pathways. Every rustle of leaves made her heart jump, but she remained focused. Hours passed, and Lydia's patience was tested, but she was determined not to leave her post. She spotted a man approaching Gerald's grave, which confused her since she expected the woman in the black hat. The man walked slowly, carrying a bouquet of flowers. Lydia squinted, trying to make out his features. He didn't look familiar. Her heart raced as he knelt by Gerald's grave and placed the flowers gently. Lydia's mind whirled with questions. Who was he? And what was his connection to Gerald? The man placed a bouquet on the grave, and despite her confusion, Lydia called out to the man, wanting to know who he was and why he was there. "Excuse me," she said, stepping out from behind the tree. The man looked up, startled, and stood. "Who are you?" Lydia asked, her voice firm but curious. She needed to understand his presence here. The man hesitated, then began to speak. The man introduced himself as David, claiming to be an old friend of Gerald's. Lydia raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "I didn't know Gerald had a friend named David," she said cautiously. David smiled sadly. "We go way back, from college days. I've been out of the country for years, only recently came back." Lydia nodded slowly, still unsure. The unexpected meeting stirred up more questions than answers. David explained that he had been looking forward to meeting Lydia. "Gerald spoke about you all the time," he said softly. Lydia felt a lump in her throat. "He did?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "He adored you, always said you were the best thing that ever happened to him." Lydia blinked back tears, a mix of sadness and confusion washing over her. "He mentioned a gift from Gerald that he wanted to return to her. Before he passed, Gerald gave me something to hold on to. Said it was meant for you," David said, reaching into his coat pocket. Lydia's heart pounded. What could it be? She watched as David carefully pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I think it's time you had this," he said, holding it out to her. Lydia was torn between leaving with David and staying to catch the woman. She glanced back at Gerald's grave, then at the package in David's hand. The mystery of the flowers still gnawed at her, but the promise of a gift from Gerald was hard to ignore. "I don't know what to do," she murmured, her mind racing. David waited patiently, understanding the weight of her decision. She hesitated, weighing her curiosity against her desire for answers. The woman in the black hat had been so elusive, and Lydia felt so close to discovering the truth. But here was David, offering a piece of Gerald she hadn't known existed. Lydia took a deep breath, trying to decide. Her curiosity about the woman was strong, but her need to connect with Gerald's past was stronger. Lydia and David went to a nearby cafe to discuss Gerald and the mysterious woman. They settled into a quiet corner booth, the hum of conversations around them providing a comforting backdrop. Lydia sipped her coffee, feeling a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "So, tell me more about Gerald," she said, leaning forward. David nodded, his eyes reflecting a shared sense of loss. "He was a remarkable man," he began. David handed Lydia a small wrapped package from Gerald. She took it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. The package was light, but felt significant in her hands. "He wanted you to have this," David said softly. Lydia's eyes widened, emotions swirling within her. She gently unwrapped the package, the anticipation almost overwhelming. As the wrapping fell away, she saw a folded letter and a small pendant inside. Lydia opened the package to find a heartfelt letter and a pendant. The pendant was delicate, a silver heart with intricate engravings. She picked it up, marveling at its beauty. Then, with a deep breath, she unfolded the letter. Gerald's familiar handwriting filled the page, each word carrying a piece of his soul. Lydia's eyes scanned the letter, her heart swelling with each line she read. The letter revealed Gerald's gratitude and love, touching Lydia deeply. "My dearest Lydia," it began, "I've always known you were my greatest blessing." His words spoke of cherished memories, undying love, and deep appreciation. Tears welled up in Lydia's eyes as she read, feeling Gerald's presence as if he were right beside her. The letter ended with, "Always yours, Gerald." She clutched the letter to her chest, overwhelmed by emotion. David suggested they investigate together to find the woman in the black hat. "We can figure this out, Lydia," he said, his voice filled with determination. Lydia nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I think we should," she agreed. They quickly devised a plan to stake out the cemetery again, this time with David by her side. "We'll get to the bottom of this," David assured her, giving her a reassuring smile. Back at the cemetery, Lydia found that another bouquet was placed on Gerald's grave. Her heart sank as she approached the fresh flowers, their vibrant colors contrasting with the somber setting. She knelt beside the grave, gently touching the petals. The bouquet was different this time, a mix of lilies and daisies. Lydia looked around, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious visitor, but the graveyard was empty. Lydia feared it might have been the woman, and after asking the groundskeeper, her fears were confirmed. "She was here again," he said, nodding. Lydia's heart raced. "Did you see her?" she asked urgently. The groundskeeper sighed. "Yes, just for a moment." She left the flowers and walked away quickly. Lydia felt a mix of frustration and determination. She was so close, yet the woman remained elusive. The groundskeeper gave her good news, though. As he said, he caught her on camera. Lydia doesn't recognize her, though. He showed Lydia the footage, a grainy image of a woman in a black hat. "This is the best shot we got," he explained. Lydia studied the image, her brow furrowing. The face was partially obscured, making it difficult to identify her. "Do you know her?" the groundskeeper asked. Lydia shook her head. "No, but it's a start." David told Lydia that it was partially his fault that she had missed the woman and offered his aid. "I'm sorry, Lydia. If I hadn't distracted you, you might have caught her," he said, guilt evident in his eyes. Lydia placed a hand on his arm. "It's not your fault, David. We'll figure this out together." He nodded, determination returning to his face. "Let's do this," he agreed, ready to help. They interviewed old friends and colleagues, gathering bits of information. Lydia and David visited people who had known Gerald well, asking about anyone who might fit the description of the mysterious woman. Each conversation brought small details, fragments of a larger picture. Some remembered a woman visiting Gerald at work. Others recalled seeing her at social events. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, pointing them towards a particular flower shop. Lydia and David began their joint investigation, visiting places Gerald frequented. The flower shop stood out among the clues they had gathered. "This is where we need to go next," Lydia said, feeling a surge of anticipation. David nodded in agreement. They made their way to the shop, hoping it would bring them closer to the truth about the mysterious woman. They visited the shop and learned about a regular customer matching the woman's description. The florist, a kind elderly lady, welcomed them warmly. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. Lydia described the woman in the black hat, and the florist's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, she comes in often," the florist said. Lydia and David exchanged hopeful glances, feeling they were on the right track. The florist confirmed the woman's visits, giving Lydia and David a new lead. "She always buys the same flowers, white roses and peonies," the florist explained. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know where she lives?" David asked. The florist nodded. "I've delivered flowers to her before. She lives in the neighborhood just a few blocks from here." Lydia felt a surge of excitement. They were getting closer. Lydia and David followed the florist's lead to a nearby neighborhood. The area was quiet and charming, with tree-lined streets and cozy houses. They walked slowly, scanning the surroundings for any sign of the woman. "This is it," David said, checking the address the florist had given them. Lydia nodded, her eyes focused on the houses ahead. They needed to be discreet, not wanting to scare her off. They discreetly observed the area, hoping to spot the woman in the black hat. Lydia and David found a spot where they could watch without being noticed, blending in with the neighborhood's calm atmosphere. Time seemed to stretch as they waited, their eyes darting from house to house. Lydia's heart pounded with each passing minute. She hoped their efforts would pay off, leading them to the answers they sought. After a few hours, they saw her enter a quaint house, confirming her identity. Lydia's breath caught as she recognized the woman from the cemetery. "That's her," she whispered to David. They watched as the woman disappeared inside, a sense of triumph mixed with nervousness washing over Lydia. They had found her, but now came the hard part: confronting her. Lydia steeled herself, ready for what lay ahead. Lydia felt a mix of nerves and determination as they approached the house. She knocked on the door, ready to finally uncover the truth about the woman. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced at David for reassurance. He gave her a supportive nod. Lydia took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. The wait seemed interminable, every second dragging on as she stood there. The door opened, revealing the woman in the black hat, who looked surprised. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes widening as she took in Lydia and David standing on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. Lydia could see the curiosity and confusion in the woman's eyes. She swallowed her nerves and stepped forward, ready to explain her unexpected visit. Lydia introduced herself, explaining her connection to Gerald and the flowers. "My name is Lydia, and this is David. We've been visiting Gerald's grave and noticed the flowers you've been leaving," she began. The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for intruding, but we've been trying to understand who's been leaving them," Lydia continued. The woman sighed, a look of understanding crossing her face. The woman revealed herself as Gerald's ex-wife, explaining she left flowers out of respect. "My name is Elaine," she said. "Gerald and I were married a long time ago. We stayed in touch over the years, and I've always respected him deeply." Lydia was taken aback by the revelation. "I had no idea," she murmured. Elaine nodded, a wistful smile on her lips. "I visit his grave to pay my respects." She shared stories of their past, showing her continued admiration for Gerald. Elaine invited them inside, and they sat down in her cozy living room. She spoke fondly of Gerald, recounting their time together and the bond they shared. Lydia listened intently, feeling a connection with this woman who had also loved Gerald. "He was a wonderful man," Elaine said softly, her eyes shining with memories. Lydia and the ex-wife discussed their shared loss and the impact Gerald had on their lives. "He was always so kind," Lydia said, her voice soft. Elaine nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "He had a way of making everyone feel special," she replied. They talked for hours, sharing memories and finding comfort in their connection. It was healing to speak openly about Gerald and the love they both had for him. They agreed to visit Gerald's grave together, paying their respects as a united front. "It feels right to do this together," Lydia said. Elaine smiled, a hint of relief in her expression. "I think Gerald would appreciate it," she agreed. They planned their visit for the following week, feeling a sense of peace in their decision. It was a way to honor Gerald's memory and acknowledge the bond they now shared. Next week at the grave, they placed their bouquets, sharing a moment of reflection. The morning was serene, the air filled with the scent of fresh flowers. Lydia and Elaine stood side by side, their hands resting on Gerald's headstone. "Thank you for being here," Lydia said quietly. Elaine nodded, her eyes misty. "We're here for him," she replied. They stood in silence, each lost in their thoughts, yet united in their grief. Lydia felt a renewed sense of understanding and acceptance, ready to move forward. As they walked back to the car, she realized how much this journey had changed her. She felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The mystery of the flowers had brought her unexpected clarity and peace. "I think Gerald would be happy to see us like this," she said. Elaine squeezed her hand in agreement. She reflected on the journey, feeling grateful for the unexpected connections made. Lydia never imagined she would find solace in Gerald's ex-wife, yet here they were, bonded by their shared love for him. The investigation that started with suspicion had ended with friendship and understanding. Lydia smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart. She knew Gerald's memory would always be with her, but now she could carry it with a sense of peace.